So for the last, 5 or 6 days, I've been that annoying person reading a book and looking up from the book and saying, listen to this. And often, first of all, sometimes I'm alone in the room, so it doesn't really make any impression at all. But when there are other people there, they listen and they go, well, that's very interesting. And they kind of hope I won't do that 5 more times in the next hour, and they are disappointed. And the book is Robert Hilburn's amazing biography of Randy Newman. Now, I got to admit, I'm the target audience for this book. I've been fascinated by Randy Newman for, more than 35 years. So maybe you won't find it as interesting, but I can't believe that you won't find this an amazing conversation. I haven't had it yet, but I don't see how it can be anything other than riveting.
What has happened down here is the wind have changed. Clouds roll in from the north and it start to rain. Rained real hard and it rained for a real long time. 6 feet of water in the streets of Evangeline.
We're doing a show about Randy Newman today. The occasion for doing that show is a remarkable book by our guest, Robert Hilburn. It's called A Few Words in Defense of Our Country, a biography of Randy Newman. Even picking a song to start with was a struggle because there's so many. And I picked this.
That was a brilliant one. If I had to pick any Randy Newman song, he's written 40 that I would think of. 25, 30, I would think of as his best song. But that song tells more about him, goals, his passion.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think also, if you remember the experience of listening to it when it came out, I remember thinking, at least I think I remember thinking, a lot of artists were starting to use strings, and the Beatles were fooling around with strings. But it always sounded like, oh, they're going to try to use strings now. George Martin's going to help them. Whereas this just seemed so beautiful. The whole arrangement is gorgeous and very organic and not forced. And so Robert Hilburn, maybe that's a place to start, is that there are multiple versions of who Randy Newman is. But even as early as this, he was a guy who was very comfortable in front of an orchestra, conducting an orchestra, writing for 20, 30, 40 pieces of an orchestra. And it's just one of the many manifestations of this guy's many talents. I don't know, maybe just begin by just saying, you've written other biographies, obviously. What drew you to Randy Newman?
I chose Randy Newman because I like singer-songwriters. I wanted to write about singer-songwriters. I was music critic at the LA Times, Los Angeles Times for 35 years, and I wanted to write books about songwriters who I thought would be 50 years from now, you'd still remember their songs. So I did Johnny Cash as a country artist, Paul Simon as a traditional pop artist, and then Randy Newman was the next one. And Randy and Paul and Dylan are my 3 favorite songwriters. What Randy brings to it is unique, though, because it's as you mentioned, he grew up in a family of film scorers. His uncle Alfred was the great film scorer of the 30s and 40s. He learned that. He studied composition at UCLA, but he was intimidated by trying to tackle that. So he goes into pop music, and in that, he brings that nurture or nature skill of arrangements to it. But he also wrote fantastic lyrics, and he wrote the most important thing about Randy Newman, aside from his creative skills, is that he picked subject matter that was unique. One of my favorite quotes, if I can just read you something really quickly, he said, "I've always gone against 2 things that sell 90% of the records in America. It's like I came across a fork in the highway and took another road. The songs are about things that need to be noticed, places like ghettos and slums that should shame everyone. It hurts to see people living like that in this rich country, where the fact that one zip code entitles you to a better medical care and the wrong one can be a death sentence." So 95% of the songs he wrote were never heard by mainstream America because they were never played on the radio. They were controversial. They were sophisticated. They weren't just easy to digest, which is what radio wanted. And this song, of all the things, captures all of that flavor: the orchestration, the subject matter. He wrote about the flood, the flood in Louisiana, of the country in 1927, and other writers had written about it. A lot of blues artists had written about it. Even Dylan wrote a song about it, but they were all done from the sense of the person suffering. Oh, I lost my baby. Oh, I lost my house. And Randy looked at it in a different, brilliant way. He looked at it, why did this happen? Who let people down? And he read, like books about it. He studied it, and he came up with the idea that the federal government let him down, the state government did, the rich people in the town, the poor people were just washed away. And that was the subject matter. He in his songs, he doesn't protest. He tries to explain what led to the conditions and touch people that way. And that song you picked is just the essence of what he does.
Yeah, and Robert, I think also it's different from the efforts of a lot of people who've tried to write songs and have written very compelling songs about inequality and social justice and social injustice. Because the other thing that Newman does, and it's there in this song as well as others, is to try to inhabit the thought processes of some of the people who are the bullies or who seem to be participating in deepening these kinds of inequalities, these kinds of injustices. And so what are they thinking? And sometimes he's able to achieve a kind of mind meld with them where you at least begin to understand something that we in America have so much trouble understanding, which is how does the other person who believes the opposite of what I do, how does that person think? And what is that person's lived experience that gets them to the point where they think this thing that I find kind of repellent? And it's like, in order to do Paradise Lost, John Milton had to sort of figure out how Satan thinks. And Newman has kind of done the same thing, up to and including, and we'll get to his Faust a little bit later. But it seems like that's the thing he does that's really radical.
Well, and there's two reasons for that. One reason is his uncles, who were huge in show business, said, don't let people know about you. Don't tell any, just play your music. Don't tell people about your personal life. Don't reveal yourself in your music, because it'll hurt. So he's very private about his personal life. He doesn't want to be a spokesman. He doesn't want to be making lectures and stuff. So he doesn't want to reveal himself. So one reason he writes in the unreliable narrator form. He uses somebody else's words. He inherits the role of another character, and that's one reason radio wouldn't play him. They couldn't figure out who was singing some of these songs. I mean, he says terrible things in some songs, and it doesn't. Is he saying that? Is someone else saying that? It was very difficult. And in the song Rednecks, it was probably the one he most defined that role. He, instead of protesting segregation in the country, he took the idea of a Southern bigot and said, what would that person say about this topic? And he thought the absurdity of that position was more important, was more telling, more touching, more moving than anything he could say, like, don't do this, this is bad,
The other thing that he has been, I mean, there's so many things. By the time we're through talking, we will have said many things that Randy Newman has been. But I mean, for me, I was in college in the mid-'70s and starting my career as a journalist in '76. He was just incredibly funny in a way that nobody else was. Certainly a song like Political Science, which is very, very, very dark, was just funny in a way that I'd never heard before.
We give them money, but are they grateful? No, they're spiteful and they're hateful. They don't respect us, so let's surprise them. We'll drop the big one and pulverize them.
And Robert, one of the things that knocked me out, I mean, I should just say, and I'm the target audience for this book. This is a page turner for me. On every page, I'm reading and I'm looking up and going, "Shut up! I didn't know that." But that he was worried particularly I think after Political Science, that he would kind of get lumped in with Tom Lehrer. Not that he didn't admire Tom Lehrer, but Tom Lehrer is like this guy who does songs like The Vatican Rag. I mean, he's kind of not entirely serious as a musician, and he's funny. But I mean, we should say a little bit about just how purely funny Randy Newman is.
Yeah, that's very true. After in his by the second album, he wrote songs like Political Science, Lonely at the Top, several songs. Reviewers started treating him like he was a stand-up comic, you know. And he said that I want to make points and I want to make positions. I don't want to be known as a comic. I want to be known as a songwriter, as a thinker. And so he moves away from that. But nobody else has used. It's so difficult to use humor in pop music. I mean, think of the few records that have been funny. And also, it's very unusual to use humor in serious topics. You know, Dylan, when he wrote Blowin' in the Wind and those songs, those weren't funny songs. And no protest song is really very funny. But Randy, 50% of his songs are very funny. And, one of my favorite is the one he did about Obama when he was running he thought that people were voting against Obama because of his color. And he wrote, the song is based on White Christmas. I'm dreaming he won't be the brightest, perhaps, but my candidate will be the whitest, and I'll vote for that. That's a great little couplet,
Yeah, I think one of his funniest songs, and it's maybe not all that well known, is The Girls in My Life, Part 1. And this, he has several kinds of unreliable narrators, Robert. He has guys who are bad guys who will intentionally mislead you about what they're really doing or about the values they embody. They're bad guys and they don't necessarily want to tell you the truth. But he also has the clueless, unreliable narrator. So this is some guy who's singing this kind of Eagles-type song, about running down the road trying to loosen his load, except that he hasn't really had any experiences with girls.
Met a girl at the bakery. She wanted to borrow my car from me. I said, take it, baby. She took it down to Mexico. Ran over a man named Juan.
What really is remarkable, and I got accused in some reviews of being too favorable, too impressed by Randy. And my God, it does sound like hyperbole if you say he almost can't write a bad song. But if you listen to his songs, that's what you hear. And that song you pick is like, I would pick it maybe at number 50, number 60 of his list of great songs. But it's a great, it's a great song,
Well, one of my rules in this conversation, Robert, is to stick up for Born Again, which is the album that song appears on, which is clear from your book. An awful lot of people thought that was a valley as opposed to a peak. And I actually think Born Again is just a tremendous record. And he's starting to get into this kind of Kurt Weill, Brecht thing. He writes this song called, I think, They Just Got Married, which is it's kind of a very sinister depiction of happiness and how easily it collapses and resurrects itself. I actually think Born Again is a really good album, but it's weird because he's been a critic's darling and a musician's darling his entire career. But that doesn't mean everybody has always liked everything, Robert.
Well, the thing that sabotaged that record, that destroyed that record, was the cover. Because he had done Short People just before that, and that was his first big hit. And that album, Little Criminals, sold, I guess, 500,000, 600,000 copies, and he had never sold more than 300,000 or 400,000 before that. And people thought, so then he comes, and that amused him because even selling 600,000 or 700,000 albums isn't the top of the world, because in those days, the Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles and people were selling 30 million albums, and so it wasn't like a huge hit. But he took it as he thought it was a joke by dressing up in Kiss makeup and standing on it by a desk like a businessman, like he was a rock and roll businessman now that he was a star. And people thought he was putting down rock and roll. They thought it was a nasty song, nasty cover, and people just couldn't get by the cover. Some of the and they. just reject the album, critics included. But there were some wonderful songs he's singing in that album.
Well, he's so easy to misunderstand, too. And I think, over the course of listening to him, you're going to make mistakes.
Sure.
I, for example, things that I understood and got right were things like the song Mr. Sheep, which is also on that album, which is about bullies, one of several songs on that album about bullies. I totally got that his sympathies were with Mr. Sheep. Apparently not everybody did. The I Love L.A. guy, the narrator of that song, I can tell he's sort of a jerk who's, he sings about mountains and trees, and then a bum over there who's down on his knees as if they were all kind of the same scenery. I could tell he was a jerk. I could tell also on that album, the real emotional girl, the guy who's singing about that girl, he's revealing things he should never reveal.
She's a real emotional girl. She lives down deep inside herself. Turns on easy, it's like a hurricane. You would not believe it. Gotta hold on tight to her. She's a real emotional girl.
But I didn't understand Short People. I thought it was a critique of the arbitrariness of bigotry, that, you could pick anything and make it into an act of bigotry. And I also, on Born Again, did not understand that Randy Newman really likes the band known as ELO, the Electric Light Orchestra. I really thought he was tearing them apart. And I guess for a minute or two, they did too.
Yeah, you are the first person I've met, even as a friend or in the interviews I've done about the book, who understands some of those songs. Nobody understands Real Emotional Girl. Nobody understands Mr. Sheep. Nobody understands the Flag Song, because there's no way to know that. I mean, you do, and Randy thinks you should be able to do it. He's not trying to show he's smarter or tricky or anything. That's the way he wanted to do the song. But I didn't understand the Emotional Girl. I thought it was one of the sweetest songs I ever heard. And Art Garfunkel sings it in his solo shows and says it's the best song Paul Simon never wrote. but it is. And Mr. Sheep, I thought, I was like, why is he doing this? This is so stupid. Everybody knows that, why? I just thought it was a dumb song. But you got it. Yeah, that's really remarkable. Congratulations.
Well, it's the thing about the Mr. Sheep is it's playful. And so, I mean, it sounds playful. The guy is these people are taunting this, man in the gray flannel suit kind of loser guy who's, schlepping home from his job or something.
Tell me, how's your little family? How's your little wife? Are you going to live with those monsters for the rest of your life? Maybe you got a little girlfriend stay somewhere in town. Maybe you ain't got a little girlfriend. Poor Mr. Sheep.
That's funny. That's a funny line, even in the context of this horrible, domineering, bullying narrator. I mean, so every song almost presents a couple of different edges to it that you could either focus on or not focus on.
Yeah, that's great. Randy would be so happy to hear you say all that, because his whole life, almost every album, there'd be some song that people misunderstood. And he would always say, look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make, confuse you, but it's the way I feel the song should be. And that's great. And because I argue, I said, Randy, there's no way somebody can understand Real Emotional Girl. And, I become the advocate, give me some hint that the guy is not the girl. But again, you get it. That proves his point.
He would occasionally give interviews talking about stuff like that, because I think he did understand anyway at a certain point. Not everybody was going to understand everything. Hey, as long as we're talking about misunderstandings, I mean, I went and re-listened to a ton of stuff getting ready for this. And I was reminded of the fact that, occasionally there are songs that might sound a little tossed off, This is pretty easy, and it's kind of a chord structure maybe we've heard them do before, or a style of piano. And then you listen to them more closely, And I really loved what this composer, Michael Roth, who has worked a lot with Newman, said, which is that he was trying to play the music at one point off of sheet music, off of songbooks. And he was kind of thinking, and then he listened to what Randy Newman actually does when he plays these songs, what he does with his left hand, what he does when he leaves a note out of a chord, stuff that isn't in the sheet music, but is really unbelievably sophisticated. I mean, even You've Got a Friend in Me, it's got that little clarinet lick at the beginning. There's like all these little bon mots, these little gifts musically inside the songs.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a very good point. You are the best student of Randy that I've met.
Well, I'm a borderline fanatic. So this book has been so much pleasure to me. Robert, we're going to take a really quick break here. We're going to come back with more of Robert Hilburn. Hopefully I'll be able to stop gushing. But a few words in defense of our country, a biography of Randy Newman, is what Robert Hilburn is here to talk about. We will be right back.
Yeah, you've got a friend in me. You got a friend in me. You got a friend in me. You got trouble, and I got them too.
We're back. We're back with Robert Hilburn, longtime music critic for the LA Times and biographer of several other musicians, but now he's got a biography of Randy Newman, and that is what we are talking about today. We need to talk about the person, and one thing that comes through in this biography, not surprisingly to me, is that if you can think of a criticism of Randy Newman that Randy Newman has not directed at himself in a very self-lacerating way, you should win some kind of stuffed animal for that, because the entire history of this guy, really from the jump, is one of massive amounts of self-doubt and just a belief that, or a concern, a worry that what he's doing just isn't all that good. And it's always accompanied by a sense that what he's doing is really good and it's not being understood properly. Both of those things are running on twin tracks here. But say a little bit more about that, about the man and his self-image.
Well, he got so much of his self-deprecating side from his uncles, because they were that way. Alfred Newman, the greatest of the uncles in terms of film composing, Randy's father wanted to be a composer too, a film composer, and Alfred said, no, my success was a fluke. You go be a doctor, do something else. This is it's an awful business. It's hard to write. It's lucky. I was lucky to be doing what I do. I'm not sure it's any good. So somehow, nature or nurture, Randy picked up on that sensibility. When he was 8 years old, he would sit sometime with Alfred, and Alfred would be telling him how hard it is to do this piece of music and how difficult, and he would sometimes turn to Randy and say, do you think this is any good? An 8-year-old kid. And he would sometimes, before he'd go out and conduct an orchestra, he'd throw up backstage. So Randy sees all of this as a youngster growing up, how hard this work is. And so he gets this terrible insecurity. After his first album failed, sold 5,000 copies. It was acclaimed by the New York Times and New Yorker as a great record, but it didn't sell anything. He went in his house for months and didn't want to come out again and go in the studio. His record producer would go by his house every once in a while and say, Randy, come on, it's time to do some more music. And Randy would say, and think how sad this is, nobody cares. That's what he thought, So he had this insecurity, but then when we'd get in the studio, he had this other side of the Newman family, the Alfred Newman, the perfectionism, to do the best you can possibly do. So every time he writes a song, he's torn between the insecurity on one side, this isn't any good, it's got to be better, I've got to do better, can I do better? That torment, and that really hung over him when he was making all those early studio albums. And it wasn't until later in his life, like the last 20 years or 10 years, that he's really become comfortable looking back at the music and recognizing for how good it really is.
The other thing, or one of the other things is, I think all of that is also inseparable from his own idea of his physical self. He has a pretty significant eye condition called strabismus. I would parenthetically add, I have something called true alternating strabismus, which is nowhere near as big a problem as it turns out. But he also has some pretty bad surgeries that are really either weren't appropriate or weren't successful. And it makes him appear kind of cross-eyed. That causes problems with girls, causes problems with driving. He's really not entirely safe to be with if he's driving the car. And I mean, I think that eats at his image of himself as well, that he sees himself as kind of a damaged unit, Robert.
Yes, the funny thing, when he sees his first serious girlfriend, he's walking across an apartment complex. There's a pool there. She's sitting in a chair, and he doesn't know what to say. So he walks into the pool. He steps into the pool to get her attention. That was, how he couldn't communicate hello. It was easier for him to fall in the pool, and she jumped up, oh, my goodness, to meet her that way.
And, I think all of that contributes also to his empathy for the bullied and for his distaste for bullies. It even shows up, as you point out in the book, a little bit later in his career in a song on the album Land of Dreams, in a song called Four Eyes, where he really addresses it, Robert, kind of in the context of this horrific betrayal of a child by his father. His father just takes this 5-year-old to school in this very, there's something kind of militaristic about the delivery of the boy to the school, and then this taunting that he endures.
One September morning, when I was 5, my daddy said, son, rise from your bed. I thought I must be dreaming. It's still dark outside. He said, son, if you fall behind, you'll never get ahead.
And so not for the first time, Robert, we see that. We see that Newman, he does side almost reflexively with the underdog.
Yeah, it's something that he was a huge baseball fan. It's part of the thing growing up. He was born in Los Angeles, but lived for a couple of years during the war. His father was overseas in New Orleans, and he would see things like ice cream trucks with colored on one side and white on the other. He would see evidences of segregation just as a young age. Then he gets to California, and he's a huge baseball fan. And he realizes, for a while, Jackie Robinson, who grew up 30 miles from where Randy does in Los Angeles, he becomes the first black player to do that. And he sees how terrible it is that they hold back these black players. He in pop music, he sees how disc jockeys played white versions of black songs initially. So he sees all that injustice. Then he's smart. He reads about history, and he understands he sees race riots and stuff. He lives in this it's 100% white community. It's one of the richest areas of Los Angeles. He doesn't have a black student in his class until UCLA. So he grows up with all this sense of injustice. So why does he start writing about it? He doesn't start off writing about that. He starts off writing regular pop songs, love songs, because that's what publishers wanted. But after Dylan comes along, he sees there's a change. You've got to write what you want to write. Don't just copy what's on the radio. And he has to find his own subject matter, and the subject matter turns out to be that bullying and that intolerance and that bigotry and that shortcomings in the American character. That's not going to make him a successful songwriter in terms of sales, because he knows he's not going to get these things played in the radio. So he sacrificed a lot of money, and he could have written a lot of pop songs like You've Got a Friend in Me and I Love L.A. and those things. He could have been very successful, but that's not what he wanted to do. He finally made most of his money when, after he got enough courage, after Good Old Boys and some of those albums, he started going back and taking up the challenge of being a film composer like his uncle, and he does very well in it. He starts making it more than $1 billion a picture, so he gains wealth through songwriting, but it's the films, not the albums. And at one point in 1988, he takes up this challenge of doing film scores, and in the previous 20 years, he'd only done 3 film scores. In the next 20, he does 18. And people, his fans think, well, gee, he's not going to do any more albums. And he realizes, you know what? This film thing is very interesting. I like it. It just not. But what I do is the songs, the significant songs on albums, and he goes back to that, and he makes 3 great albums past the age of 60, and I think those are as good as the best of his early albums, Dark Matter and Bad Love, and Harps and Angels. And he does too. He really, because he brings all his skills to it, everything he learned in film, everything he read about, the Faust drama. It's got much more theatrical elements in some of those songs. That's the total blossoming of Randy Newman, these last 3 albums. And if I had to give one album to somebody, I would either give Good Old Boys as an example of the great early work, or Dark Matter as the example of the great later work.
But it is hard to pick, and I do feel as though a lot of what's on Trouble in Paradise is really remarkable as well. I mean, I could make a case for a lot of these albums.
I agree. You know, I have a thing in the thing where I had, because look, Randy's he's not a star in the sense of a record star. He doesn't sell millions of records. A lot of people don't know him except for short people. Or you've got a friend in me. And so I wanted to turn to some artists that I really admire, and I asked them to write 100 or 200 word testimonials about why is Randy Newman so good, thinking that if a reader didn't know Randy but read that they would listen to him. So I got Bob Dylan to do it. I got Don Henley, Paul Simon, Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt. I got critics, Bob Christgau. And Christgau wrote a thing that he said he has 10 people who've made more than a lot of great albums, but he said Randy Newman is the only one of them who's never made a bad album. Mm-hmm. You know, all the others, Dylan and so forth, they've all made some albums that weren't really that good, but every album of Randy's is an A.
I want to talk about another aspect of him as a performer, and I hadn't really thought about this until I read your book and then began rethinking some of the stuff that I've heard. And so one of the songs that really knocked me out from Trouble in Paradise is called My Life is Good.
A couple weeks ago, my wife and I took a little trip down to Mexico. Met this young girl there. We brought her back with us. Now she lives with us in our home. She cleans the hallway. She cleans the stair. She cleans the living room. She wipes the baby's ass. She drives the kids to school. She does the laundry too. She wrote this song for me. Listen. Yeah.
You know, Robert, one of the things that strikes me when I think about it now is he's always been kind of an interesting singer, despite not having, you know, a Harry Nilsson kind of beautiful 3-octave voice. But here I think he's becoming a really good actor. He is acting the role of this guy who is full of bluster and narcissism, but he's also letting us see somehow how thin the ice is underneath that. Like if his life isn't good, then he falls straight into the abyss. He's kind of whistling past his own graveyard. And Robert, I feel like that's almost into the realm of acting and away from singing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. He is a very, very convincing singer. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't have great voices. Dylan doesn't have a great voice, but he's a convincing singer. And that's what Randy is too. And the person he patterned himself after, casually you might say Fats Domino, because he has that kind of casual drawl. But the person who he most listened to was Ray Charles. He thought Ray Charles brought an authenticity to every vocal, and he always compares what he's doing is what Ray did. Is this authentic? Is this a believable person I'm speaking? Like the Rednecks guy. That guy sounds like he's telling you the truth. You know, you don't think of Randy Newman, you think of this guy, this character, Johnny Cutler, who is Redneck. So he is an actor. And it's a good way I would have not thought of that, but he is an actor. He wants this song to be convincing, because each song's a different character, so he wants the song to be a unique thing. It's not him singing the same song. I mean, it's not him saying, I did this, I did that. It's somebody else saying, I did this and I did that.
All right. This time is going very fast. I'm talking to Robert Hilburn. He's written an amazing book, a biography of Randy Newman, A Few Words in Defense of Our Country. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to be back with our final segment.
A friend of ours happens to be staying. And the name of this young man is Mr. Bruce Springsteen. That's right. Yeah, we talked about this kind of woodblock or something. New guitar we like.
Time to say a couple of quick thank yous. The maestro, Dylan Reyes, is the technical producer of this show. Jonathan McNichol, a.k.a. Jonathan McPants, is the producer of this episode. With us today, our guest is Robert Hilburn, a longtime music critic for the LA Times and the author of A Few Words in Defense of My Country, a biography of Randy Newman. I should say, Robert, you probably don't recognize my name, but one of my claims to fame was from about 1979 to about 1982 or 83. I was the worst rock critic in America.
Really?
I was just terrible. I mean, Randy Newman was one of the few things that I got. I was just a horrible rock critic. But I do want to say the one time that I met him in that capacity, we were backstage. He was doing a show, I think maybe at the Stratford Shakespeare Theater. And there were a few critics who were kind of whisked backstage to talk to him. And he asked us where we were from. And I said I was the rock critic for the Hartford Courant. And he went, "Oh, Hartford Courant." He goes, "Every time I look at a book and if there's a blurb from the Hartford Courant, I just think, wow, that was the best they could get. That was for the Hartford Courant." And I felt so belittled. I just felt so awful. I'm sure he was just kind of giving me his patented hard time. But I just felt, oh, that's right. I'm really not very important, am I?
He'll poke fun at people and stuff like that, but it's playful. It's a gag. You know, I'm sure he insults people. People are sometimes insulted by that, but he thinks it's funny, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that's part of it, though. It goes with his very dark and sometimes abrasive sense of humor. Hey, I want to just say that for me, I'm not sure this is going to be true for everybody, but the first part of this book was the one where I was just really yelping all the time with excitement about stuff because I first of all, I had misunderstood. I sort of thought that Randy Newman began with the album Randy Newman and continued to the album 12 Songs, and then from there we get to Sail Away. But really there's this whole other thing that happens first. Starting like in 1961, 62, he's kind of in these music publishing, kind of almost music factory environments where he's writing songs that are being recorded by like the Fleetwoods and people like Pat Boone are going, "Hey, that guy's a pretty good songwriter. Maybe I should get him on my team." Like nobody knows who Randy Newman is except people who are working in the music business in LA, but he's actually writing a lot of songs that are getting recorded, Robert.
Yeah, they weren't very good though. You know, he was trying to copy what was on the radio, and he could copy some of them pretty well. You know, a lot of friends of mine have spent a lot of money to go back to try to find the original versions of those songs, but none of them were particularly good. And the same thing happened with Paul Simon. That's the way you learn the craft. You know, they both went through that period until they finally have to realize they have to find their own voice. And what do I really want to say in a song? And that's the most important thing. Your voice is the most important thing. You know, your voice and what's your outlook, your viewpoint, how you want to, you know, your subject matter.
So I'll just have to say my favorite anecdote from that whole time. One of the times I put the book down and went, "Shut up." So Peggy Lee is kind of becalmed in her career a little bit. She's in some doldrums, as are Lieber and Stoller, the guys who wrote all the Elvis, many of the big Elvis hits. Then they're out of sorts with each other, too. Peggy Lee's mad at them about something. Somehow or other, they wind up shopping over to her a song called "Those Were the Days." You know, probably some kind of rough track demo, maybe one of the songwriters actually singing on it. And Peggy Lee listens to it and she says, "This is great, but I want an arrangement and I know who I want it done by." And I think at this point, that first Randy Newman album had come out, just called Randy Newman, and it sold 5,000 copies. But that's who she's thinking of. She's heard this guy's music and she thinks this is the guy who can arrange and conduct this. So I get the hit that I know I can have out of it. And Robert, I had no idea of any of that. That was so amazing.
Well, and the funny thing was, Randy hated the song. He hated the arrangement, you know, and so he does an arrangement of it, and it becomes this huge success. And Lieber and Stoller say it's all due to him. He saved the record. But what I really respect about Peggy Lee who was a great singer and really stood up for herself. She was a producer, you know, although women didn't get credit in those days. But she heard his first album. She would sing some of those songs in nightclubs before, you know, anyone heard of Randy Newman. And she did a version of a song called "Have You Seen My Baby?" that I just think is fantastic. There's so many unusual things in Randy's life, but that was certainly an unusual thing. But the fact that here's this young unknown artist, and Lieber and Stoller, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Peggy Lee, all the time, turned to him to fix it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that becomes clear is it's like there's an egg where this really exciting chicken is gestating, and it's Randy Newman. And so the first album comes out, Randy Newman sells 5,000 copies. The next one, 12 songs, comes out. I think it does kind of similarly anemic sales, not really creating a lot of chart activity. But already after those two albums, the people, I mean, you say you're getting criticized for saying that he never wrote a bad song or put out a bad album, but I think the other people who would say that are the musicians who by then, like even somebody, I didn't know about him really until probably the Sail Away album, but the musicians knew about him. And there's this anecdote that you put in there that supposedly there's one night where a lot of these Laurel Canyon songwriters are gathered kind of swapping songs, and somebody has a song that, you know, they think is really good, and everybody kind of nods, and then Jackson Browne says, that's a good song. Maybe we should go over to where Randy Newman is working right now and see if it measures up to a really great songwriter. That's, Robert, that's what they think of him.
Yeah, that's true. And, you know, he was, first album, Paul McCartney phones him to say what a great album it is. Brian Wilson writes him a letter to say what a great album it is. I mean, he got from the big get-go, he got that the acceptance of his peers. They knew this guy was great. The radio didn't know it. Most pop fans didn't know it, but those peers heard it. And he was a real star among songwriters before he was ever famous.
You know, it's also interesting the way some of these songs have second and third lives. Like You Can Leave Your Hat On, which is a pretty early song, and it's another very, very funny song. Although it's also a song that has this odd pivot too, because it initially is just this guy making, you know, bizarre requests or somewhat bizarre requests of what we presume is maybe a sex worker, but she's got to take off this and take off that, but she can leave her hat on. But then it kind of takes this odd thing where he suddenly goes into this kind of paranoid thing about suspicious minds are trying to break us up and trying to interfere with us, and they don't know what love is. And it's sort of a different song at that point, that he has this idea that this is a full experience of love and that they're deeply misunderstood. But, you know, you just think years and years later, they do the movie The Full Monty. They take, I believe, the Joe Cocker version of that song, and they use it a completely different way.
Mm-hmm. Well, Randy is so smart. He thinks of all these different alternatives when you're writing a song, and part of one thing will slip in and part of something else will slip in. But he's beyond any. I mean, his father said he had scored the highest IQ of any kid in the LA school district when, you know, at the time he was in high school. But, you know, there's one song I really ought to mention that I think is probably the most important song he wrote. It was the first great song he wrote. It was when he was sitting down saying, well, look, what should I write about that I care about? I'm going to stop writing these love songs. And he writes a song called I Think It's Going to Rain Today.
Broken windows in empty hallways, a pale dead moon in a sky streaked with gray. Human kindness is overflowing, and I think it's going to rain today.
It's beautiful. It's some people say it's more straightforward than other stuff he wrote, but, you know, more than 100 people have recorded that song. Ella Fitzgerald, Peggy Lee, Dusty Springfield over the years. I think Peter Gabriel did. And the thing, but it scared Randy, and he would put it down when he first wrote it, saying, oh, it's too much like one of those Simon and Garfunkel sad folk songs, because he reveals too much about himself in the song. Remember, his uncle said, never reveal about yourself, never give people a chance to attack you. But he's the guy who thinks it's going to rain today. That's his outlook, that self-deprecation is real. He thinks this isn't going to be any good. Whenever he hears a new suggestion, one of his managers would say, oh, that's going to be a mess. He would always resist it, thinking it's not going to work. And he sees life. A friend of mine said, you know, when I wake up in the morning, LA is a beautiful day, I look outside, I think it's going to be a great day. Randy sees that same sky and thinks it's going to rain today, and he doesn't want to do anything. He doesn't want to do interviews, doesn't want to go downstairs, doesn't want to do anything except go in his room and watch television, kind of escape from it all. And that song, and so after that song, that's when he comes up with the unreliable narrator. How can I write songs that express feelings without it pointing the finger at me? And so that was the first great song he wrote, and it was the pivotal song to the other great songs.
Yeah, it's a song also very explicitly about feeling sorry for oneself, which I think is something that Randy Newman prefers and thinks, generally speaking, you would do in private. You wouldn't do it.
The thing that Dylan wrote for the book, he points to that song. That was the first song, Randy Newman song he heard, and he said, it was sad and it was cynical. You never hear that in the song. And he said, and he ends up by saying, Randy Newman, king of the mountain, always was and still is.
I love the anecdote in the book where he finally meets Dylan, and I think he and a bunch of people go out to a bar, and because of Randy Newman's bad eyesight, he has a whole conversation with Bob Dylan, but he's actually talking to someone else, and then realizes that.
Oh, I love your song. I love this song. You write so, and he's talking to John Hammond, the son of the record producer.
and then he turns to Dylan, and Dylan, is praising him and saying, maybe I'll move out to Los Angeles, and then maybe I could write a song like Lucinda. And Randy kind of gets swept up in the moment. He's kind of yes-anding that idea, and you should move to LA, and he's kind of being a little bit more of a big shot maybe than he typically wants to be.
Yeah.
And then the next day he thinks about it, and he thinks, Lucinda, that's 3 chords. What do you mean?
Why
you
would
could
you want to write a song like that?
Yeah. Why would you want to do something like that? So he's always kind of undermining himself one way or another. We are running out of time here, and I think it's probably important to talk about the song that lends its title to your book, and it is a song that's released towards the end of the Bush administration, and it's Randy basically, once again, as an unreliable narrator, offering defenses against some of the critiques that are starting to come against the U.S. because of its behavior, the Iraq War, the holding of people without charges in places like Gitmo, the rendition to black sites and stuff like that. So he sings this particular song. Maybe say a little bit about the song and why it is your title.
Well, he sang that song. It was a period where he was very, very discouraged about the direction of the country. And he writes this song and sings it a few times in Europe. And Europe, more than America, England and Holland, and they somehow understand. Ireland understands Randy's songs better than a lot of people in America do, just like you do. So anyway, he wanted to write this song in defense of our country. There have been other worse people in the country than us, and he sings it in New York. And the New York Times writes thing about it, and the editor of the New York Times, or the editorial page editor, likes the song so much that when Bush gives his State of the Union address, he gets permission from Randy to run the lyrics to his song as the alternative to the State of the Union.
So just as we're wrapping up here, you said this earlier in the conversation, but I want to come back to it again. These songs, they have a way of becoming even more poignant or more pressingly relevant at different times. And so here we are, it's mid-January, mid to late January of 2025. A song like Roll With the Punches, which was devastating kind of callous rejection of the problems of the poor and weak when it was released. Wow, it just seems, Robert, like it could have been released today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, we go back to Louisiana in 1927. He writes it, and then Katrina brings it all back again. I mean, the whole thing happens again. The federal government, Bush flies over the place. They're not helping. They didn't. The levees weren't strong enough. The city government didn't protect him. The exact things that Randy pointed out in the 1927 flood, those conditions were repeated again. And when he goes down to New Orleans, he sings at the Jazz Festival, and it's like the whole audience sings along with it. It's like that's become the state's unofficial anthem now. Dozens of other New Orleans artists have recorded the song. It has a living presence. And to hear him sing it, and it's on YouTube, you can probably find it, and the audience singing along, they're trying to wash us away. What a fantastic thing to put all that emotion and history and dishonesty and injustice into 20 lines, and so simple, not a word of protest in it.
Well, we end right where we began, so that's perfect. A Few Words in Defense of Our Country is Robert Hilburn's wonderful biography of Randy Newman. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. It's been great.
The end of an empire is messy at best. This empire's ended, like all the rest. Like the Spanish Armada, drift on the sea. We drift in the land of the brave, home of the free. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye.